mentioned Watts' connections with the Louisiana Boxing and Wrestling Commission. The rules for professional wrestling in Louisiana were last amended in 1974 and are pretty archaic. Things like deliberately throwing an opponent over the top rope are expressly prohibited, but the Royal Rumble was held here in New Orleans in 2001. I'm not ignorant to how things run down here, but do you know how involved promoters were with setting regulations for pro wrestling before the business was exposed? Did promoters work with legislatures and commissioners to get regulations they wanted?
Well, it depends on, like, you know, everybody's heard recently that the Kentucky Commission for the past number of years, and they've softened it up now, but still, because of the hardcore wrestling, they were very restrictive. And everybody's heard that Oregon for years had a restrictive athletic commission in terms of drug testing, and that's why WWF wouldn't go there. And there's been some states that have adopted, you know, ridiculous rules for the commissions based on the sins of all the hardcore wrestlers or the false advertising or the bullshit that, you know, has happened over the last 20 years or whatever. But in those days, the rules of wrestling as as governed by the Louisiana Athletic Commission were whatever the fucking promoter told them the rules were. Here's our rules. That was the rules of wrestling. If you throw a guy over the top rope, it's a disqualification. If you jump off the top rope and hit somebody, it's a disqualification. In a lot of places, if you throw them into the iron post deliberately, it's a disqualification. Not that any of these things weren't done. They were just done behind the referee's back. So imagine that the heel would get some heat. And also they weren't done to death, so that way they would register with people when they were. You know, back when promoters actually knew how to promote fucking wrestling. And wrestlers knew how to wrestling. You remember even when everybody knew what the rules of wrestling were. You automatically knew when you saw a DQ, that was the pop, because you knew when the referee said, you knew exactly what happened. You knew how long the count was on the floor, or the count was to break, or the various intricacies were of wrestling as a sport. You knew the fucking rules. And that's the way that angles were done around the rules and people breaking them to draw money. So I'm sure that probably Leroy McGurk or whoever, Watts had a hand in it. Watts' attorney at one point was on the Louisiana Commission. And he was over with them because he was running the Superdome 4 times a fucking year and making him a fortune in tax revenue with a successful promotion. So, of course, he was over with them. But that was before the formation of Mid-South Sports. It was Leroy McGurk or whoever said, here's the rules of our wrestling company. And that's the rules of wrestling. Now, in the Northeast, for whatever reason, they didn't call being thrown over the top rope a disqualification. And it seems like even going back to the days of the 50s and 60s with the old WWF, they were always more lax with recognizing the rules and treating things, you know, with a sporting presentation. But pretty much everywhere else, those were standard rules. And business existed for, 100 fucking years under those goddamn conditions until we fucked it all up, and now nobody knows what the fuck's going on.
So much has been talked about how the promoters and the territories tried to fend off Vince McMahon. Do you know of any stories of any promoters being able to actually go to the athletic commission they have this long-standing relationship with, that they're regularly earning tax revenue for, and saying, hey, let's not let these guys run here, or what can we do to hurt them?
Oh, well, yeah. Every single one of them.
And it didn't work anywhere.
Well, no, here's the thing. In some places, I mean, it didn't work in terms of stopping what he was going to do. But yes, there was, while Vince is always accused of, and pretty much rightfully so, as my Aunt Lola used to say, everything you do gets blamed right on you. He pulled the sabotage deals with pay-per-view providers and had exclusive contracts with buildings in the Northeast, etc. But do you think it's a coincidence that Vince McMahon, until the Attitude Era, the WWF never really gained a foothold, really was popular, or ran the prime buildings in the Carolinas, Mid-Atlantic Territory, the Memphis Territory, the Mid-South Territory, and to a lesser extent, Georgia and Florida, because all those people had, it took until those companies went out of business for even Vince to get in all the best buildings. When the WWF came here in the 80s expansion era, they went to the Commonwealth Convention Center, which was a newer building that was also smaller, pain in the ass to park, and people didn't, the wrestling fans, it was never a destination for them because Jarrett had the Gardens every week, and the Gardens told Vince to go piss off. These are our wrestling promoters. So yeah, when you had those strong territories that were still doing business right up until the end, until, Crockett sold to TBS, and with Memphis until the late 90s, but with Mid-South until they sold right at the late 80s. They were running the best building usually in town, wherever it may be. And they had the TV stations, on their side. They had the athletic commissions that they were deriving a lot of revenue. The commission couldn't bar Vince from coming in most cases. They used to be able to, but I'm sure they saw that would have been a lawsuit at that point, but they didn't have to do him any favors. I saw Flair fucking the Richmond, Virginia. The buildings were more loyal than the commissions. The TV stations were a little bit more loyal than the commissions. Pretty much everybody was more loyal than the commission. But Ric Flair chewed the fucking athletic commissioner in Richmond out when the WWF came to Richmond in '86 about letting them in. Because at the time, remember, I don't think they had done Charlotte at that point. They didn't do it often, ever, until the Attitude Era. But they came into Richmond, and fucking Flair said, "You're supposed to be the fucking commission. It works both ways. We pay you guys the cut and the tax and et cetera. Why don't you take care of the wrestling business in Virginia and keep these fucking guys off the top of us?" Which should have been actually the case, to be honest with you. That's the only way that wrestling was run successfully, was not under goddamn siege from the north, but the local promotion. But anyway, it depended. But Vince had roadblocks too from the places that had strong local promotions that were still in business and still doing business till the end.